Hello, everybody. I'm Rusty, aka William, aka Dr. Robinson, and I am the Blues Doctor. This is my podcast, The Blues Doctor Recommends, and we're very glad you're here. We've got some really interesting current events to talk about this week, so I'd like to get right into it. But first, let me remind you to like, ring the bell, share, subscribe, make comments, all of those things, and we'll get right to it. Let's go on to the calendar first. On May 9th this week, 1965, Keith Richard is in Clearwater, Florida on his first tour with the Rolling Stones of America. And he's in a hotel there, but he can't sleep because he's got these sounds running through his head that he doesn't think he's ever heard before. He finally turns on a tape recorder beside his bed, picks up his guitar, and plays this sound, which comes out in the form of a riff, into the tape recorder. Then he turns it off, goes to bed, and forgets about it. Several weeks later, he turned that tape recorder back on and got the opening riff to the song Satisfaction. Satisfaction went on to become one of the most popular of the Rolling Stones songs ever. It really broke the Stones in the US and made them a number one act all over the world. Also, Satisfaction is consistently listed among the top hits in rock and roll over the past 50 years. If not number one, it's typically in the top five. So, Keith couldn't sleep. We got a great song out of it. Sometimes dreams come true, I guess. And here's another one. May 9th, 1964. The Beatles have been number one on the US charts for 14 weeks with first I Want to Hold Your Hand, followed by She Loves You, and then by Can't Buy Me Love. However, the Beatles were knocked off the number one spot on that day by Louis Armstrong's Hello Dolly. There are not too many more extreme variations on songs than that. And when I saw it, I thought, that's just an odd and ironic thing, so I wanted to include it here. In those days, Broadway musicals were expected to generate pop hits for the US charts, and this was one of the last of those to do so. Hello Dolly stayed at number one for a couple of weeks. Louis Armstrong was a beloved figure in New Orleans and became popular all over the world as a result. And this one is probably my favorite one on the calendar this week. May 8th, 1911. Robert Johnson was born. Robert Johnson is the probably premier blues singer, guitarist, and maybe most influential American musician on certainly on rock and roll and the blues ever. Robert was born in the Mississippi Delta, specifically in Hazelhurst, Mississippi. He had a tough childhood. His biological father didn't know him, and his stepfather left the family after a few years and went up to live in Memphis. Robert eventually got shipped to Memphis to live with his stepfather, where he stayed until he was 8 or 9 years old. He then came back to the Delta and lived with a variety of relatives until he was old enough to be on his own. At the time, he started playing the guitar and the harmonica. And he was okay at both of those, but yeah, he started playing gigs in some of the juke joints and bar rooms around the Mississippi Delta, of which there were a number. However, it was recognized Robert was just a beginner. He wasn't all that talented. At least that's what everybody thought. In fact, he played a gig at one show one night and he was kicked out of the club and told to come back when you can really play, son. So he disappeared. He left town and was gone for 6 months or so, according to legend. And then when he came back, something had changed. Suddenly, Robert is a virtuoso on the guitar. His singing has become much better. He's writing his own songs, and nobody can believe how good this guy is. People were saying, well, wasn't this guy just a nobody a few months ago? And that's the way it continued. It started to generate rumors about Robert. You've probably heard some of these. People are suggesting that Robert had left and sold his soul to the devil in order to play the blues guitar. There's all kinds of versions of this. Some say he went to the crossroads, and we don't know exactly where the crossroads was, but there's several suggestions. One of which is in Mississippi at the intersection of Highway 49 and Highway 61. But there's others too. At any rate, Robert went on to have a career in blues music that attracted the attention of a representative for a label called ARC Records. This was a regional label that had recorded blues and other roots type musicians. Anyway, this representative recorded Robert on two different locations, one in 1936 and another in 1937. During those two sessions, he recorded 36 songs. And these 36 songs included some of the greatest rock and roll songs ever made. They've been covered by virtually everybody you can think of, from Muddy Waters to the Rolling Stones to Eric Clapton to Led Zeppelin and many others. Some of them include Sweet Home Chicago, Dust My Broom, the song Crossroads, about the story about the crossroads. Robert's technique by this time was just, it was mesmerizing. If you listen to these recordings, it's just amazing. Keith Richard, when he first heard these recordings of Robert Johnson, asked one of his buddies, well, who's playing the second guitar? Because he thought it was actually two guitars, when in fact it was just Robert playing the guitar and singing by himself. So that tells you how amazing these recordings were. Robert's voice is really interesting as well. He didn't realize it, but he was making use of what's called microtonality in singing, in that he would have these very subtle variations in the pitch of his singing voice from note to note that conveyed lots of emotion into his singing. In fact, Eric Clapton once said of these recordings, "This is the most powerful cry that I think you can find in the human voice." That was echoed by Keith Richard, who, when he was asked about the blues in general, he said, "You want to know how good the blues can be? Just listen to Robert Johnson. This is as good as it gets." Those recordings from 1936 and 1937 have, as I said, influenced many, many musicians from the UK, the US, and all over the world. People like Robert Plant, Jimmy Page of Led Zeppelin, Duane Allman of the Allman Brothers, Chuck Berry, the list goes on and on. Robert's death was at age 27, and that came in August 16th of 1938. But his death was clouded in as much mystery as his life was. It's really not clear exactly what happened. It was rumored that Robert died after drinking some poisoned whiskey that was given to him in a club by a jealous husband. Story being that Robert had been flirting with a woman at the bar whose husband didn't like it, and therefore he put poison in some whiskey and handed it to Robert, who drank it out of the glass jar. He began having abdominal pains and started throwing up blood, in fact, and 2 days later he was dead. There have been some alternative versions as to what had happened. Some people have suggested that he died of poisoning. It was suggested that it was perhaps strychnine, but strychnine doesn't really affect people like that. Another possibility was naphthalene that was used and available in rural Mississippi at the time, and it was more likely to cause abdominal pain and maybe bleeding. And it was known that Robert was a very heavy drinker, so it's perhaps possible that Robert already had esophageal varices and alcoholic hepatitis, and then maybe intense vomiting from naphthalene ruptured one of the esophageal varices and caused him to start vomiting up blood. That's certainly not an unrealistic scenario as well. Some, even a little more far out, maybe, have suggested that Robert Johnson had Marfan's syndrome. Marfan syndrome is an inherited syndrome in which people are very tall, they may be very thin, they have sort of elongated cartilage, and their cartilage can be very weak. They have extraordinarily long fingers, which Robert did, and he credited his ability to play the guitar to his long fingers. Also, Marfan's syndrome is associated with aortic aneurysms that rupture typically around age 30. So it's not impossible that Robert Johnson died of an aortic aneurysm rupture because he had Marfan syndrome. Robert's death certificate was no help either. It did not list the cause of death, nor did it list any family members responsible for Robert. His burial was paid for by the county. He was placed in an unmarked pine coffin and buried in a potter's field in an unrecorded spot. Now there are at least three different locations that have markers on them claiming to be Robert Johnson's burial spot, but we'll never know for sure where Robert is buried. What we can say is, without question, Robert Johnson is the all time king of blues music. And I think it's legitimate to say Robert is the grandfather of rock and roll. And all musicians owe him a lot, as do fans of rock and roll in general. Continuing on for our medical segment for the week, we were planning on continuing our series on the annual report on cancer from the NCI this week. That was released in April of this year. But since then, we've gotten the news of the presidential order to stop funding from the federal government to Harvard University. I've had several people ask me about that, so I thought maybe we'd put aside the annual report from the NCI this week and talk a little bit about this stop order from the president. Let me give you a little background first. To get promoted as faculty in the U.S. university system, You have to jump through a series of steps that are not well understood by the public. So I'm going to try to lay them out a little bit here. The first is publications. You have to be the first author of a number of publications in either journals or books, or even occasionally now some of the new media. But at any rate, you have to have a certain number of first author publications to be qualified to move up in stature from, say, assistant to associate professor. Number two in the educational criteria, academic criteria, is service. In other words, you have to provide some kind of service to a community. It can be your local community. You could define community in other ways as well. It could be, say, a community with similar work interests, say farmers or electricians or plumbers. It could be a community of ethnicities, of gender, whatever you wanted to make it, basically. You could provide a service to the elderly, for example, in your own community by setting some meal delivery service up for them. That's an example of what I mean by service. For MDs, service could be working in a free clinic, for example. Service can also be defined in other ways. For example, it could include serving on a national or international committee regarding cancer care or infectious disease or a number of other things so that you get some degree of national recognition. That generally goes under the service umbrella also. Number three, and really the most important, is to obtain funding for the institution. And what I mean by that is you bring in money either from the federal government or private philanthropy, but really federal funding is felt to be more important by writing grants for the most part. This is the major way you move up the ladder in academics. And I'll use my own case as an example. I went to Tulane Medical School right out of training as an assistant professor in 1992. Over the course of the next few years, I managed to obtain funding for research on HIV in women, particularly the association with cervical cancer in those women. I was actually given or received funding from the federal government for that. I wrote out a grant application, which ended up being probably 100 pages or so. In return, the government had a committee that looked at my application and deemed it to be acceptable. The process for this is that a committee set up by the government sends out a request for applications, that is, grant applications from individual investigators around the country. So I sent in my application, and many other people did too. The committee then reviews all those applications and decides which of them are appropriate for funding. I was lucky enough to get funding in that matter, and it amounted to $500,000 altogether, which we used to pay for several research associates. We paid for some nursing, and we paid about 5% of my salary as part of that grant. One thing that arose out of that research that I'm kind of proud of is that my work then, along with the work of a colleague of mine in New York, was used by the CDC, the Center for Disease Control, to justify inclusion of cervical cancer as a diagnostic criteria for AIDS. This was relatively early, and we really didn't know that much about HIV or AIDS in women. The CDC asked us to present our data, which we did, and they reviewed it and decided it was reasonable to consider cervical cancer to make the diagnosis of AIDS in HIV infected women. Anyway, I was later recruited away from Tulane as an associate professor to Harrington Cancer Center and Texas Tech Medical School in Amarillo, Texas. The idea was, in addition to being an associate professor now, that I would also run the cancer program at Harrington Cancer Center. And this occurred in late 1999. Then in 2003, I wrote another grant asking for funding to develop an immune targeted vaccine for women with ovarian and breast cancer. In other words, this was not a vaccine in order to prevent those diseases, but to treat them once they were already diagnosed. The NCI, National Cancer Institute, which was providing that funding, liked the idea and did, in fact, give me the funding to do that. And that amounted to about $750,000. After that, I was promoted to full professor and then even was given an endowed chair. What that means is that a grateful patient of mine who was very wealthy, one of the old oil families in town, donated something like $2 million to Texas Tech to endow a chair of research. I was allowed to use the interest money from that chair to further my research. And then the university got to add that $2 million to their endowment. Finally, then in 2010, I was recruited to come back to Tulane University in the wake of Hurricane Katrina to help rebuild their cancer research program. I had been very active in cancer research on a national level by that time and had participated and, in fact, written a number of clinical trials for the treatment of gynecologic cancers, which is kind of my specialty, plus some quality of life studies in cancer as well. After that, in about 2012, I wrote another grant to the NCI for money for setting up clinical trials in the local New Orleans community, particularly for underserved populations in New Orleans. Again, the NCI liked what I did and decided to fund us to the tune of about $3.5 million, and about half of that went back to Tulane's endowment. So that generated altogether in my career somewhere between $5 and $10 million for the universities that I worked at. Now, think about that in terms of Harvard. Harvard is a very large school. They have thousands of faculty and probably several hundred who had levels of funding comparable to mine. So if you add all of that up, it actually amounted last year to about $685 million in funding that Harvard was expecting from the federal government this year. That's not coming. The funds were stopped as of the presidential order, and there is no current time set for them to come back. This presidential order was based on the level of anti Semitism on Harvard's campus and the lack of protection for Israeli and Jewish students that had been occurring there. Now, keep in mind, Harvard has the largest endowment in the country among universities at about $53 billion. That money just sits there. They don't touch it. They can use the interest from it, but they otherwise just sit on this massive amount of money. And it's far and away the biggest of any university in the country. The point of all of this is that Harvard and most other universities are making a large amount of money from the federal government each year. And based on that, I think I can agree with this presidential order. Harvard, as I said, has lots of money they're not touching, and they're doing things that are contrary to U.S. values and certainly to taxpayers' values. So, do we really want to be paying Harvard to create an opportunity for anti Semitism to rear its head and for potentially Jewish and Israeli students to get hurt? The options for Harvard at this point are that they could go fully private and just not accept any more money from the federal government, or they could go along with the rules set by the taxpayers as represented by the president and by Congress. My feeling is that Harvard will likely come to some sort of a deal with the federal government and will accept the money and abide by certain regulations. Or they could fight the federal government. In other words, they could take it to court. They could take it potentially all the way to the Supreme Court, which I suspect the government would probably do. And given the makeup of the Supreme Court at this point, it's likely that they would rule in favor of the president. So I think it's unlikely that Harvard would take it to that level. As new information becomes available on this topic, I'll try to address it here. Otherwise, we'll go back to the annual report from the NCI on cancer to continue that discussion. If you have any questions about this, I would encourage them. I know this is a complicated topic. I'd be happy to try to explain further what this problem is. On to our next topic. As I mentioned last week, I've started doing a series based on strange or unusual things in the city of New Orleans. New Orleans is my second hometown, I like to say, and I've lived there for most of the past 40 years. Over that time, I've noticed that New Orleans has lots of strange and unusual events, maybe the most of any city in the United States, certainly the most per capita. So I'd like to talk about some of those things over the next few weeks. This week, I'd like to talk about the story of New Orleans Axeman. At its heart, the Axeman story is about a serial killer. And sadly, that's not an uncommon occurrence in a lot of large cities in the United States. However, the Axeman story in New Orleans has so many twists and turns and so many subplots that it's really unique among serial killer stories. Here's what we know for certain about the story. In May of 1918, the U.S. was in the thick of World War I and was fairly tense as a result. I can remember my grandmother saying her husband, my grandfather, was away in France at that point, and that so many young men were away from the country at that time that it seemed kind of ominous, particularly considering that they might not be coming home. Well, that's the atmosphere that the Axeman story was set. It was certainly tense in New Orleans. There have been many troop ships that went in and out to the war. So the Axeman story took hold specifically on May 19th, 1918. The fear level went up dramatically on that night when Joseph and Catherine Maggio, Maggio, were murdered in that home, which was in the back room of a grocery store that they ran in uptown New Orleans. This is pretty common in that era for Italian grocers to live in the same building where they worked. New Orleans had been a site of immigrancy from Sicily for some time, and so there was a large community of Italian Americans in New Orleans. They were murdered at night in their beds. Their throats were slashed by what appeared to be a straight razor, and they were bludgeoned over the head with what appeared to be an axe or hatchet. They were discovered by Joseph's two brothers who were coming over to start work in the morning. They found eventually that the intruder had broken in through a panel in the back door that had been chiseled out, and they ended up finding both the straight razor and the axe with blood on both of them in the surrounding yard. There's an interesting subplot or twist to this story also. Turns out that someone, presumably the killer, had written a message in chalk on the sidewalk outside of the Maggio's home. It read, "Mrs. Maggio will sit up tonight just like Mrs. Tony." And that was theorized to be a reference to another murder that was Anthony and Joanna Chiambra, other Italian grocers who were attacked in 1912. But we don't know that for sure, and those messages were never repeated. In other words, there were no other messages in chalk left at any of the scenes. And there turned out to be 8 separate attacks in the New Orleans area over the next 17 months by the killer that came to be known as the Axeman. In almost all the cases, the victims were found in their beds at night and they had been struck by an axe or hatchet. Some of them had had their throats slit as well. Most of them died, but there were a few survivors. However, none of the survivors could give an adequate description of the killer other than saying he was large, dressed in black, and moved very quickly. Perhaps the most interesting subplot or side story to this twist and turn was that a letter was delivered to the New Orleans newspaper, the Times-Picayune, around this time. This was actually March 13th of 1919. So it was after a few of the attacks had occurred. And the letter read like this. It was from Hell, March 13th, 1919. It was addressed to Esteemed Mortal. They have never called me, and they never will. They have never seen me, for I am invisible, even as the ether that surrounds your earth. I am not a human being, but a spirit and a demon from the hottest hell. I am what you Orleanians and your foolish police call the Axeman. When I see fit, I shall come and claim other victims. I alone know who they shall be. I shall leave no clue except my bloody axe, besmeared with blood and brains of he whom I have sent below to keep me company. If you wish, you may tell the police to be careful not to rile me. Of course, I'm a reasonable spirit. I take no offense at the way they have conducted their investigations in the past. In fact, they've been so utterly stupid as to not only amuse me, but His Satanic Majesty, Francis Joseph, etc. But tell them to beware. Let them not try to discover what I am, for it were better that they were never born than to incur the wrath of the Axeman. I don't think there is any need of such a warning, for I feel sure the police will always dodge me, as they have in the past. They are wise, and they know how to keep away from all harm. Undoubtedly, you Orleanians think of me as the most horrible murderer, which I am, but I could be much worse if I wanted to. If I wished, I could pay a visit to your city every night. At will, I could slay thousands of your best citizens, for I am in close relationship with the angel of death. Now, to be exact, at 12:15 earthly time, next Tuesday night, I'm going to pass over New Orleans. In my infinite mercy, I'm going to make a little proposition to you people. Here it is. I'm very fond of jazz music. I swear by all the devils in the nether regions that every person shall be spared in whose home a jazz band is in full swing at the time I've just mentioned. If everyone has a jazz band going, well, then so much the better for you people. One thing is certain, and that is that some of you people who do not jazz it out on that specific Tuesday night, if there be any, will get the axe. Well, as I am cold and crave the warmth of my native Tartarus, it's about time I leave your earthly home. I will cease my discourse, hoping that thou wilt publish this, that it may go well with thee. I have been, am, and will be the worst spirit that ever existed, either in fact or realm of fantasy. Signed, the Axeman. As a result of the letter that was published in the Times-Picayune newspaper, that Tuesday night, which was in March of 1919, was chaotic in New Orleans. Virtually every bar, every club, every home had jazz musicians playing. People started having Axeman parties, basically, where they used it as a opportunity or an excuse to drink a lot. Something that's not unusual in New Orleans, perhaps akin to hurricane parties. At any rate, the jazz musicians in town were doubling their regular rates and getting it to play, so they were happy with the situation. A song was even written, which became a hit in New Orleans at the time. The Mysterious Axeman's Jazz, quotation, "Don't Scare Me, Papa." And that song, a sheet music version, was played by most of the bands in town. The last murder attributed to the Axeman came on October 27th, 1919, when Mike Pepitone and his wife Esther were attacked. Mike died, but Esther escaped. She described the killer as a large figure dressed in black. And there's another subplot that goes into this that is really interesting. In December of 1921, so 2 years later, Esther Pepitone, the wife who survived the attack, shot and killed a man named Joseph Monfrey in Los Angeles. And Esther claimed that he was the murderer of her husband, Mike Pepitone, 2 years before that. Now, for reasons unknown, after that happened, it was reported in the newspapers in Los Angeles, but Esther dropped out of sight. And there was no other written description that can be found of what happened as a result of that shooting. It was later found that a man named Joseph Mumfree had lived in New Orleans and had mafia connections. As I mentioned earlier, there was a large Sicilian population in New Orleans at the time. So some people have speculated that the murders were part of a mafia vendetta. Most of the victims were, in fact, Italian. Also interesting, I mentioned before there were two non-canonical victims of the killer from 1912, and that was an Italian couple named Chiambra. And they were shot by an intruder rather than hit with an axe in their home in the lower Ninth Ward in New Orleans, May 16th, 1912. The male Chiambra survived, but his wife did not. In newspaper accounts, the prime suspect in this killing was somebody by the name of Monfrey, and that was mentioned more than once. While this was obviously very different from the Axeman's regular modus operandi, if Joseph Monfrey were indeed the Axeman, the Chiambras may well have been early victims. My friend Kalila Smith related a story to me about the Axeman, at least indirectly. There is a hotel in the French Quarter on Ursuline Street. It's actually called the Haunted Hotel, and it has this story associated with it. I'll let Kalila tell it in her terms. As part of the series on high strangeness in New Orleans, I thought this week we'd like to talk about the story of the Axeman. That was a serial killer that was around about 1918, 1919, and I've detailed much of the story about him elsewhere in this podcast, but I thought I'd invite my friend Kalila Smith, who's here with me today. Kalila is a nationally known expert on the paranormal and the supernatural. She is also the founder and manager of Haunted History Tours of New Orleans, which is, without question, I think, the premier ghost tour, paranormal tour in the New Orleans area. So if you're ever in town and you want to take the so-called ghost tours, this is the one to take. It's the original. It's the best one. There's really no question about it. So, Kalila, what I'd like to do is to ask if you could relate to me the story you told me before about the association of a hotel in town with the Axeman.
Thank you, Rusty. Yes, several years ago, while I was teaching, I used to teach a paranormal class over at University of New Orleans and also at Delgado. And I used to take my class on a real investigation. We'd find a haunted place and we would go there. And a few years back, I went to the haunted hotel on Ursuline Street. And it used to be a residence actually, but over the last few years, they've turned it into this really nice hotel. And they call it the haunted hotel because they've had a lot of ghostly activity there. So it was the perfect place to bring a class and to let them get a feel for doing a paranormal investigation. Now, I myself am a medium and a psychic, and I tend to pick up a lot of things using my senses, my body. So I had my students with all of their equipment. And while we were in the courtyard, I became aware of a presence diagonally towards the back garden. And I just got this ominous feeling about this person hiding back there. I could envision a person hiding behind things, keeping themselves kind of hidden. And I felt as if it was somebody who was hiding from the law, somebody who had committed a lot of crimes and was hiding from the law. Now, we got distracted by a lot of other things. We started going into the building and talking to other ghosts. There was a lovely lady up on the second floor that had passed away, and we got a lot of EVP with her. And it was so exciting to have all of this phenomena. I thought, well, why don't I bring another psychic in and his group and see what they get in comparison? Because it, paranormal activity and paranormal investigations, it's not an exact science. I mean, you go in and you get things and you have to rule out everything else that possibly could be a physical cause before you could say it's actually ghostly activity. So it never hurts to have a second opinion from another paranormal group or another psychic, what have you, and see if they get the same results. And interestingly enough, I brought in my friend Sid Patrick, who is also a medium, and he came in with his group, and the last place we entered was the courtyard. And it was amazing because the first thing he zoomed in on was that corner, that back corner. And he says, I feel like somebody's back there who had committed a lot of crimes. This person killed a lot of people, and he's hiding back there. Now, we talked about this. We didn't get any EVP or something. We're working strictly on a psychic level for this. So I don't have any pictures to show you. But I found it real interesting that I had told him nothing and we both kind of came up with the same feel for the place. Now, what's interesting is that on Ursuline Street, in that area of the French Quarter, during the time in which the axe murderer was killing a lot of the Italian community, a lot of Italian grocers in particular around the city and mostly in the French Quarter, that entire area of the French Quarter had become low income housing for Italian immigrants. So a lot of those larger properties, that's when they started getting divided up into apartments and eventually condos because numerous families would rent these large homes and live in these, basically turn them into tenements. And so we know that at some point in time that it was a residence, it would have been occupied by the Italian immigrants, the people who came here in New Orleans in the early 1900s. And the biggest murder mystery that we had going on, and really the only serial killer at the time, was the axe murderer. So these are things that we kind of piece together like a puzzle. You know, can we prove it? No, we can't, because the axe murderer was never caught. So we still don't know who it is. It's the probably the most famous cold case in the country is that nobody ever really could decipher who or what the axe murderer was. There's a lot of theories out there, but again, we piece it together like a puzzle. So we told the owner of the hotel, because it was pretty exciting. It was like, wow, we think possibly we know somebody was here hiding from something after committing some murders, but it could have even possibly have been the axe murderer because that location right there on Ursuline between Royal and Charters would have been the perfect location for somebody to hide because you've got the main building, then you've got a side building going this way with some of the units in the back behind these banana trees. And it would have been the perfect place for someone to hide in plain view, really, just hiding in plain view and being able to come out of that side door, slip out into the night, murder whoever he wants to murder right there in the French Quarter, and then slip right back in without anybody ever knowing a thing. So while it can't be proven, it's a great theory. And the hotel took the ball and ran with it, and they put on their advertising, "We are the location of where the Axeman lives." And there's your story, Rusty.
Thank you, Kalila. We're glad you were here. I'd like to point out that that's the Haunted Hotel. That's the actual name of it, the Haunted Hotel on Ursuline Street in New Orleans. And it is a boutique hotel, and you can book rooms there now. Any rate, Kalila, I hope we can get you back again sometime.
Hope so.
So, who was the Axeman really? We'll probably never know. It certainly could have been just a lone psychopath, as is the case with multiple serial killers, or it could realistically have been a mafia vendetta. As I said, we'll probably never know for sure, but what we do know is that there are lots of movies and books and TV shows about the Axeman, and people still in New Orleans occasionally have Axeman parties to this day. Anytime some news or mention of the Axeman comes up, people will just have a party. That's the way it goes in New Orleans, I guess. And that's about all I had for this week. I'd like to put in a plug for a couple of other podcasts that I'm a fan of. First off, Casino Guitars has a great podcast. It features the owner, Baxter Clement, and Jonathan Robinson, no relation. In fact, the cool guitar, the Gretsch guitar that you see on the wall behind me, came from Casino Guitars. If you're interested in guitars or you want to buy a guitar, check out Casino Guitars. They're actually located in Southern Pines, North Carolina. They can do online work, over the telephone work, or they have a brick and mortar shop that you can actually visit. And they'll treat you right. Maxter and Jonathan and the rest of their staff are all very nice guys, and I wouldn't hesitate to buy another guitar from them. And another podcast that I'm a fan of is the Dr. Huge show. And this is on professional wrestling, which is one of my interests. Dr. Huge claims he is the king of some media and that he has the smartest audience in all of the Hugienverse. So check out Dr. Huge, Huge, sometime. So, the Blues Doctor's prescription for the week. Number one, check out the process for federal funding for universities. There's lots more detail about that than I've included here. And again, I would be happy to answer questions about it. Second, check out the story of New Orleans Axeman. There's many interesting subplots, as I mentioned, and I didn't talk about all of them here. Or maybe even better, just plan on having an Axeman party at some point. Finally, as I say each week, please watch next week's podcast. Okay? See you later.